thought it'd be good to bring you in because one thing I think is like when you have great players that were really good here, you can ask them specifics
Right.
about certain positions that I know a little bit, but you're an expert at it. We're gonna dive right into it. Defensive line, I think, at least from my opinion, played a little bit better. First, talk about what it takes to be a good defensive lineman, and then where do you see some guys improve to be a little bit more consistent this year?
Yeah, I think the thing that and we heard a lot about it from the moment that Coach Rule got here was he was trying to make them tougher, right? Toughness, toughness, toughness. About how he preached it all the time. You want to be a tough football team. I think when you talk about, especially on the line of scrimmage, whether it's offense or defense, you better have tough guys, right?
Right.
I mean, especially now in the Big Ten conference, there's still a lot of power football. You got to be able to stop the run, which Nebraska did a pretty good job of, especially later on in the season. But yeah, I think to start with, you got to be tough. And then obviously, the difference usually between the offensive and defensive guys is, athleticism.
Right.
I mean, it'd be a lot easier if we had somebody fat, like Hoskinson or
Yeah.
Taylor or somebody sitting next to us to go through this segment because it'd make it certainly a lot more fun talking about how fat they are and unathletic. If the guys that played back in our day, they had to be athletic though
Right.
as well. But there was just you kind of you figured out which side of the ball you belonged on.
Yeah. Real quick.
But yeah, you got to be able. Some guys are better at being told what to do, when to do it. Defensive guys, they don't have that luxury, right? I mean, they kind of anticipate snap count. You got to have great hands. You got to be able to react to things. So yeah, those are some staples, I think. But the things that I always preach, and when we were down there too, to be a great defensive lineman, you got to have great get off, you got to have great hands, and you got to have a great second step.
Right.
Because that second step, that's the one that's changing direction, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean those three things, but hands and get off, those are staples.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about footwork because I didn't realize how important it was when you explained it to me one day. I think we were eating lunch, and you're talking about it like it's almost like pitter patter, right? You almost like, but you're going and eating up ground.
Yeah,
I think a lot of kids get infatuated with what they see on YouTube with these pass rush
yeah,
coaches,
yeah,
whether you're doing, swim move,
yeah,
long step,
yeah,
Euro step, and doing all that.
yeah.
Talk about the footwork about it because I think it's from Michael Strahan, even Aaron Donald right now, J.J. Watt and T.J. Watt. Those guys have it down pat, and it's what you guys used to do all the time.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between guys that are lining up on the edge as opposed to the guys inside. The guys inside, you don't want a big, long first step, right? Because
Right.
then you kind of get this gap in between you, and it's hard to get your second step back up. So you want almost a shorter, quicker. You want to get that foot up and down, but still gaining ground. On the end when they're kind of going after the quarterback, they can kind of take those kind of
Yeah.
longer, like you kind of getting out of the blocks. But even when you see those, track dudes, I mean, I know everybody's kind of got, I guess, different theory, but I think you see some of those guys, they're trying to get as many steps in
Right.
sometimes, right? After that first step, they're kind of boom, they're getting those legs up and down and they're grinding. And yeah, Amon probably
Mm.
could speak well to that. But yeah, big difference. I mean, you just got to, it's such a, it really, sometimes people, when you talk about footwork or whatever, they kind of just think of it maybe in big terms, but like you said, it really kind of comes down to just these tiny little
Right.
just the difference between like a 45-degree angle
Right.
and 55 degrees and or 35 degrees, and where that puts you. You certainly don't want to come out of your stance and have like duck feet,
Right.
like you lose kind of your power in
Hey
there. So
man, chill out now. That's
well,
me.
I know how you,
That's me.
but when it's game time, you're
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
you're running to the
Yeah.
ball, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you're not even thinking about that. But when you walk down the street, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so you kind of want to keep, you want to keep your weight kind of underneath your feet. You don't want to get too wide. You definitely don't want to get too narrow.
Right.
When you talk about that second step, you don't want to, when you got to turn, you don't want to step back in Coach McBride used to call it stepping in a barrel, right?
Right.
Where then you get your feet kind of together. You don't want to get too wide. You just always got to have a nice base. You got to be able to keep your feet moving. Usually, the area that you could see it with defensive linemen, right? I mean, once you get engaged, a lot of guys, the first tendency is to kind of stop their feet, and you see it a lot, like down on the goal line, where guys they just sometimes they're fighting for leverage, but then they forget about their feet, and then when their feet stop, that's usually
Yeah.
it. You're done, right? If the guy that's working his feet is usually going to be the guy that wins that battle.
What are some of the things, the defensive line I felt last year started to kind of play more
Yeah.
consistent,
Yeah.
maybe after the change in scheme. You can give your opinion on that. I just felt like they started to kind of dictate a little bit more. Correct me if I'm wrong, but talk about how they were able to have that good foundation from last year and how it kind of flowed over into a Coach Knighton this year, which they
Yeah.
were able to be more consistent.
Yeah.
It seemed like from game 1 to game 12. Just talk about that from your perspective and your intimate knowledge.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think when you look at what they were trying to do under Scott, they were in a lot of 2 eyes and 4 eyes.
Right.
Those are alignments
Yeah,
for
talk
some
about like
people
where that's
listening,
at
right?
for
Yeah.
the
So head up, on the guard would be just a 2 technique. Head
right.
up on the center is a 0. If you're kind of shaded on the center, that's just a shade. 1 technique. Well, you don't really use, I guess, 1 technique.
Yeah.
Nobody really, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't think that anyone calls. They usually just call it a shade, I think. But 2 eye is your outside eye is on his inside eye. So it's not quite head up, you're inside, and the same 3 technique is
Yeah.
outside shade of the guard, 4 eye is inside shade of the tackle. Kind of gets a little confusing out there. It goes to 5 technique, goes to outside, 6
Yeah.
technique is back inside, head up. But yeah, so they under Chins and Bill, they were, and I don't want to say it was Bill's
Yeah.
idea to keep him in 2 eyes, but that's what we had been running,
Right.
up to that point. And I think this year you're seeing a more where you got Nash, where he's either in a 0, he's kind of head up on that center, or he's shaded, or they're in 3 techniques, or wide 3s, kind
Right.
of real loose 3s, almost 4 eyes, but kind of more in that gap. Sometimes you see them in 5 techniques. You're seeing more defensive end play, kind of similar to what we had. So I like that, and obviously there's I think they're just being more aggressive.
Right.
I know playing those 2 eyes and 4 eyes, those are 2 of the toughest techniques to play. I never had to play one really like on a consistent basis until I got to Carolina, and it's tough. You're kind of you're giving up this angle here automatically, right, in your alignment, but you're kind of tight to that guy, that tackle, right? Whereas in the 3 technique, you still got a little bit of room there where if you get up the field and you get off the ball quick enough, you can kind of play either, behind that block if that tackle's blocking down, or, you can still play in front of it. But I just like with the way they've gotten, it seems like a little more aggressive,
Right.
than maybe what we had been doing.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing that's it was in which I think allowed them to get to the ball more.
Yeah.
Right. To kind of
Yeah.
where you can kind of make
Yeah, you don't
plays
want,
out of the tackle or out of the stack.
I mean, you can talk to too. You don't want defense to be that complicated,
Right,
right? I
yeah,
think that's
yeah.
what was so great about Charlie. It was, hey, you put your hand in the dirt, ball snaps, you go find the ball. You
Yeah.
play the block, and then you go find the ball. It was same way
Same,
all the
yeah.
way back at 2nd level, 3rd level. Obviously everybody's got their rules and
Right.
stuff they have to do. On any particular play, but yeah, you just want to be aggressive. I mean, Charlie always used to say playing defense was 80% emotion, 20% technique,
Right.
right? I mean, don't overthink it. I think sometimes, I think we can bog them,
Down with too much.
bog them
Yeah.
down with too much. And I think, that may have kind of creeped in, I think a little bit, especially when you don't get off to a good start, right? Because then everyone starts to panic, right?
Right.
And it's like, well, maybe we're not doing enough. We got to do more. Let's do more, more, and more. And more is not always the answer. I mean, Charlie, he wanted us to watch some film, but he did not want us going home watching like 6 hours of film,
Right.
right? He did not like if especially up front. If you can play with good technique, I don't. I mean, when I say technique, I mean hands and feet and leverage and all that stuff that I was talking about. You should be able to play anything for the
Right.
most part. Some
Yeah.
some techniques are harder than others, but I think you should be able to play most techniques. And the name of the game playing defensive line is kick the what out of the guy in front of you and go
Right.
find the ball.
How before we go to break here, at what point in your career? Because we were talking about earlier in the week where some people can turn the page too quick on a recruit or a
Yeah.
player
Yeah.
because you can tell the way I looked when I came in there as a freshman, they probably like get him up out of there. How long into your career playing, especially on the D line with the people you played behind, you're like, okay, now I'm starting to kind of get it a
Yeah.
little bit,
Yeah.
got true
Yeah.
confidence versus I always say when I first started playing, I was just out there kind of staying out of the way versus, all right, I'm here to make plays.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was, your redshirt freshman year and
Yeah.
my redshirt sophomore year when we're starters for the first time. And I remember being out there and being like, man, I just don't want to screw up.
Right.
Just don't screw up. And if I can get to the ball carrier second or third or
Yeah.
something, I'll be happy with that.
Yeah.
And then I think the difference then was my junior year. And that's 4 years then in the program.
Right.
I mean, and I know kids want to play now, right? But the reality is, especially when you're talking about redshirting and stuff, your year at the end of your career, as opposed to playing a true freshman year, you can be a whole lot better at the
Right.
end. Do you know what I mean?
should
So
be,
I don't
yeah.
know why guys feel like, well, if I'm not playing, I'm leaving, or I'm not going there, or I'm transferring, or whatever. Sometimes you just got to trust in the process, and it's not always in your best interest to
Right.
get out there, your freshman year. Now, at the same time, I think fans got to kind of, lower their expectations a little bit on
Right.
some of these new guys coming in. What you did in high school doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Once you get here to Nebraska, you might as well just erase your high school career permanently, or you get to any school, right? You go to Miami, you get
Yeah.
to Florida State, Georgia, Alabama. What you did in high school doesn't mean anything at this point, right? It's all about what you do now. So if you're not ready to go, then just, take the
Figure it out.
redshirt year, take some time, mature. I mean, you remember what it was, and I was fortunate. I had my brother here my first year,
Yeah.
so my adjustment was a little bit easier than some other guys who came here, didn't know anybody.
Right.
So I think sometimes they're in a little bit of a rush. I think the fans, they want them to perform right away. Sometimes, most of the time they're not ready. But on the flip side, they also can't, rip these kids to shreds when they go out there. As a true freshman, if they get thrown out there and they don't succeed,
Right.
doesn't mean the guy's going to be a bum or whatever.
Right.
He still may end up being a great player for you. But the criticism and the name calling, everything on social media, that stuff, if you do that to a true freshman, that has the potential to ruin him for the rest of his career.
Yeah. That's a lot of insight there. It's good stuff there because look, he's one of the best defensive tackles to play here.